Welcome to the Olive Grove podcast.
Great to be here.
Our whole idea here is pretty simple, really. You send us stuff you're curious about, articles, texts, whatever.
And we dig in, we try to pull out the most important bits, the interesting insights.
Exactly, so you can kind of get up to speed without drowning in information,
Helps you stay informed without feeling totally overwhelmed.
So for this deep dive, we're looking at a source that explores 1 Corinthians chapter 7.
Ah, yes, a really foundational text when it comes to, well, love and marriage from a biblical standpoint.
And the source we're using is MCS 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It seems this chapter was Paul responding directly to questions the church in Corinth actually had.
That's right. They were writing to him, asking for guidance on some very practical matters.
So we'll be touching on marriage, obviously, but also singleness, as Paul discusses both pretty extensively here.
Okay, let's jump in. Chapter 7, verse 1. It starts with the question put to Paul.
Yeah, is it good for a man to keep away from women? A pretty direct question.
It is. And remember the background. Paul spent the first 6 chapters dealing with all sorts of internal church problems in Corinth, scandals, divisions.
Right.
And now chapter 7 marks a shift. He's answering their questions, specifically starting with this one about biblical marriage.
And it's interesting how the source immediately defines what marriage means in this context. It's specifically a sexual relationship between a man and a woman within that marital commitment.
That's a crucial point. The physical aspect is definitely part of the picture Paul's painting. It's not just about companionship.
So how does Paul answer that initial question, verses 2 and 3?
Well, he doesn't directly say yes or no to keeping away. Instead, he gives practical advice because of the situation in Corinth. He says basically because sexual immorality is such a huge danger there.
Which the source really paints as a sort of sin city, right? Where sex was almost like a religion for some.
Exactly. So Paul says, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. And importantly, fulfill your marital duties to one another.
Marital duties. That phrase might sound a bit formal today.
Maybe, but the source points out Paul is stressing this mutual responsibility within the marriage to, well, meet each other's intimate needs.
It makes you think about how that principle applies now, the balance between personal freedom and looking out for your partner.
It really does. It frames marriage as a partnership where you're actively considering the other person's needs.
Which flows right into verse 4, doesn't it? This idea of mutual belonging.
Oh, definitely. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife.
Wow, that's quite a statement, especially back then.
It's incredibly countercultural for that time. Think about the patriarchal norms. Paul is putting the husband and wife on like an equal footing in this very intimate area. Mutual respect, mutual yielding.
It really sounds like that Genesis one flesh idea coming into practice.
Absolutely, a real merging of lives.
And this connection has, practical consequences. Verse 5 and 6.
Right. Paul says, don't deprive each other sexually. The only exception is temporary, mutually agreed upon, and for a specific spiritual purpose, like focused prayer.
Why? What's the reason he gives?
To avoid temptation by the adversary, or Satan.
So the source seems to suggest that a healthy, regular sexual relationship in marriage is actually presented as a form of protection, like against affairs or maybe even pornography addiction, things like that.
That seems to be the implication, yes. It's a protection against external temptations by meeting those needs within the marriage covenant. It's a holistic view, spiritual, emotional, and physical.
Okay, interesting. Now, verse 7 is one that often gets discussed. Paul says, I wish that all of you were as I am.
Yeah, that line causes a lot of speculation. As I am, meaning single, presumably. But then he immediately adds, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that.
And the source we're looking at adds some really helpful context here. It pushes back on the idea Paul was always single.
Right. It mentions the possibility, even probability, based on things like the Mishnah suggesting Sanhedrin members had to be married, that Paul might have been a widower, or perhaps abandoned by his wife after his conversion.
So him wishing others were like him might have been less about singleness is better and more about his specific, maybe difficult circumstances and his intense focus on his mission.
That makes a lot of sense. And he calls singleness the ability to focus intensely on God like he was doing a specific gift. It's not presented as inherently superior, just different. A different calling.
Which leads into verses 8 and 9, where he advises the unmarried and widows directly.
Yes. He says, basically, it's good to stay unmarried like me if you have the self-control. But, and this is key, if you don't have that control,
Then get married.
right? Better to marry than to be consumed by passion or sexual desire.
So the source really debunks the idea that Paul's making singleness the more godly option here. It's practical advice.
Exactly. It's about managing temptation and living righteously within the reality of human desire. Marriage is the God-given provision for those who don't have that specific gift of celibacy.
Okay, this is fascinating stuff, really digging into the nuances.
It really is.
Now, just before we dive into the next section about married couples and mixed-faith marriages, we wanted to mention something. If these kinds of discussions resonate with you and you're looking for maybe a place to connect with others online about faith,
You might want to check out the My Christian Space community. It's designed to be a supportive environment for exploring faith together.
yeah, just something to look into if you're interested. And also, while we're talking about practical aspects of faith and community.
We also wanted to give a quick mention to Enduring Freedom Ministries. They do some really vital work.
They really do. Their goal is pretty straightforward. Provide essentials for someone in need. We're talking a hot meal, some groceries, clothing, even a haircut and laundry services.
And what's amazing is they estimate they can provide all that for one person for just about $4 a month.
So if you're looking for a tangible way to help out, maybe consider supporting them. A small monthly donation can make a real difference. We'll put info somewhere accessible.
Okay, good stuff. Shall we get back to 1 Corinthians 7?
Let's do it. So after addressing the unmarried, Paul turns to those already married in verses 10 and 11.
And here, he's very clear. This isn't just his opinion. This is a command from the Lord.
What's the command?
Married couples shouldn't separate. A wife shouldn't separate from her husband. And a husband shouldn't divorce his wife.
And if they do separate?
Then the instruction is to remain unmarried or else be reconciled to their spouse.
It really shows how seriously Scripture takes that marriage commitment, doesn't it? It's not meant to be easily dissolved.
Absolutely not. But then Paul addresses a specific tricky situation in verses 12 to 14. And here he says, this is his counsel, not a direct command from the Lord.
What's the scenario?
It's about a believer married to an unbeliever, where the unbelieving spouse is willing to stay in the marriage.
Ah, the mixed marriage situation. What's the advice?
The believer should initiate a divorce. Don't leave just because your spouse isn't a believer.
And he gives a reason, right? Something about being set apart.
Yes, it's this interesting concept. Paul says the unbelieving husband or wife is sanctified or set aside for God through the believing spouse. And this status extends to their children, who are considered holy.
So the believer's presence has a kind of positive spiritual influence within the household, even on those who don't yet believe.
That seems to be the idea. It's not saying the unbeliever is saved through the believer, but that they are brought into a sphere of God's grace and influence.
Okay. But what if the unbeliever wants to leave? That's verses 15 and 16.
Right. If the unbelieving spouse chooses to separate, Paul says, let it be so. The believing brother or sister is not enslaved in such circumstances.
Not enslaved, meaning they aren't bound to force the marriage to continue if the unbeliever insists on leaving.
Exactly. God has called us to live in peace. While there's always hope that the believer's life might draw the unbeliever to faith, how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? That hope doesn't mean staying in a situation against the other's will, or maybe even enduring harm. Peace is paramount.
That offers a measure of release, then, in those really difficult situations.
It does. Then Paul pivots slightly in verse 17 to a more general principle.
It is.
Basically, live the life the Lord has assigned to you and remain in the situation you were in when God called you. He says this is his rule for all the churches.
Remain in your calling. How does he illustrate that?
Well, verses 18 and 19 use the example of circumcision. Were you circumcised when you were called? Don't try to become uncircumcised. Were you uncircumcised? Don't seek circumcision.
Because those external things don't matter for salvation.
Precisely. What matters is keeping God's commands. It drives home that salvation is by grace through faith, not based on these outward markers or rituals.
And he applies this same principle to social status, even slavery, in verses 20 to 22.
Yeah, he says, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although, he adds, if you can gain your freedom, do so.
But the core identity changes, right?
Absolutely. He makes this powerful statement. The one who was a slave when called is the Lord's freed person, and the one who was free when called is Christ's slave.
It completely flips worldly status on its head. Your ultimate identity and loyalty are to Christ.
It really does. And verses 23 and 24 drive this home. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Stay in fellowship with God within whatever situation you are called.
Don't be enslaved by human rules or expectations. Powerful stuff. Okay, then verse 25, he comes back to the unmarried, the virgins.
Yes, and again, he's careful.
Mm.
Now, about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So this is his considered opinion.
What's the opinion? Given the present crisis or time of stress, as some translations put it.
Which, the source suggests, likely refers to the pressures and difficulties in Corinth itself. Paul thinks it's good for a person to remain as they are single.
But marrying isn't wrong.
No, he's clear in verse 28. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. He's not forbidding marriage. He's just being realistic that marriage, especially in stressful times, brings worldly troubles or challenges.
And the source drew a line from that to maybe contemporary situations where government definitions of marriage might clash with biblical ones. Not saying Paul predicted that, but the principle of navigating external pressures.
Right. Believers have their biblical understanding, even while living within broader societal or legal frameworks that might differ. Paul's acknowledging that navigating the world, especially when married, has complexities.
So verses 29 to 31 seem to expand on this idea of perspective.
Yeah, it's that reminder that the time is short, the present form of this world is passing away. So whether you're married, mourning, rejoicing, buying things, do it all with a sense of eternal perspective. Don't get overly entangled in worldly affairs because they're temporary.
That focus on the eternal really shapes his advice, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, which leads into verses 32 to 34, where he contrasts the concerns of the unmarried and the married.
How does he put it?
The unmarried man or woman is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how to please the Lord. But the married man or woman is also concerned about worldly affairs, how to please their spouse. Their interests are, in a sense, divided.
Not necessarily in a bad way, but just acknowledging the practical reality of having a family and responsibilities.
Exactly. It's a realistic assessment of the different focuses that come with each state. He's not judging, just describing the reality of balancing family life and service to God.
And then verse 35 feels like a key clarification of his motive.
Yes. He says, I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord.
So he's worried people might misunderstand his advice as being anti-marriage.
It seems so. He's reaffirming that marriage is from God, but his advice here is aimed at helping them achieve maximum focus and effectiveness for the Lord, given the challenging times. It's for their benefit.
Okay. Then verses 36 and 37 get very specific about a man and his fiancée, or perhaps his virgin daughter, depending on interpretation, but let's stick with fiancée for now.
Right. If a man feels he's not behaving properly towards his fiancée, perhaps due to strong sexual desire, and feels he ought to marry her, Paul says he is not sinning, let them marry.
So marriage is the appropriate step in that case.
Yes, but then he contrasts it. If the man is firmly resolved in his heart, isn't under compulsion, has control over his own will, and has decided to keep her as his fiancée, meaning not consummating the marriage yet, or perhaps remaining single, he also does well.
It really puts the emphasis on self-awareness, self-control, and making a resolved decision.
It does. Which leads to the summary in verse 38. The one who marries his fiancée does well, but the one who refrains from marrying, presumably because they have that gift of self-control and focus, does better in terms of undivided service.
Okay. And the chapter wraps up with advice for widows, verses 39 and 40.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if he dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes.
With one condition.
But he must belong to the Lord. She should marry a believer.
And then Paul adds his personal opinion again.
He does. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, meaning remains a widow. And he adds, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God.
So again, it's his spirit-guided judgment, his opinion based on perhaps his own experience or observation, but not a binding command for all widows.
Exactly. It shows his pastoral heart, offering counsel, but respecting their freedom in Christ.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to unpack from one chapter.
It really covers a huge amount of ground regarding relationships, calling, and perspective.
So, thinking about the key takeaways, it seems like Paul offers this really practical, nuanced view. It values marriage highly, emphasizes mutual care,
but also validates singleness as a legitimate calling, a gift for focused service. And it constantly pulls the focus back to our ultimate devotion to God, whatever our situation.
And the importance of navigating these things with wisdom, self-awareness, and maybe peace as a guiding principle, especially in difficult circumstances.
Absolutely. It encourages us to really think through these foundational areas of life in light of our faith.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Thank you. A really worthwhile deep dive.
I'm glad we could explore together. It's a rich passage.
We really hope you, the listener, found this helpful too. There's certainly a lot there to reflect on.
Indeed.
And hey, if you want more discussions like this, please do subscribe to the Olive Grove podcast on YouTube.
And you can also head over to the My Christian Space website. Sometimes new deep dives drop there a bit early.
Definitely check that out. Thanks so much for tuning in today.